and welcome to Horns for Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode, we listen to Amanda Sloat, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Sloat is speaking about Brexit. She details the path of how Britain got to this point, as well as the number of efforts on the part of both Theresa May and Boris Johnson to find a solution that was amenable both to the British Parliament and to the European Union. Sloat's insights help to understand both the implications of this for the long term, as well as the substantial challenges that are posed to the short-term implementation of this agreement. Let's listen in.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and to such a great group of people coming out and interested in what's happening in Brexit. I've given a lot of talks about this in different parts of the country over the last year or two, and I feel like wherever I am, we're always on the eve of some momentous event in the UK that's about to happen, that is about to change the trajectory of Brexit, and then nothing really changes and things continue on. So it is interesting to be here a week exactly ahead of the British election, which is next Thursday, December 12th, which I'll talk about, which I think is going to potentially be another one of those pivot points on Brexit that is going to determine the direction in which things go. People often ask me why, as an American, I actually know so much about Brexit, and will remind people, especially those that were used to working with me in the State Department and other places where I was focused more on Turkey and Southern Europe, that I actually lived in the UK for 7 years. I did my PhD at the University of Edinburgh, starting in 1997, focusing on the setting up of the Scottish Parliament and its relationship with the European Union. So if nothing else, it's very exciting that my PhD on a rather obscure political topic is relevant 20 years later. So to students interested in obscure things, have hope. It may pay off long term. I then did my postdoc in Belfast, Northern Ireland, which again seemed like a random place to go at the time. I moved there a week before 9/11, which gave my family a very different assessment on security risks that they thought I was facing before 9/11 and that they felt I would be facing after 9/11. So I come to these issues not only from an area of academic interest, but also from deep personal and almost emotional interest after having spent such a significant period of time living and working in both of these places. So what I will do is sort of go through the history of Brexit, explaining a little bit about how we got here, what some of the key issues are, where things look likely to go next week, and then I'm happy to take questions on anything that you're interested in. The first thing I would say, just as a general comment, is if you look at all of the countries within the European Union, it's not necessarily a surprise that the UK is the one that would decide to leave. The UK has always had an ambivalent relationship with the European Union. They opted out of early membership when the EU, then the European Economic Community, was formed, preferring intergovernmental decision-making in a free trade area that preserved their economic ties to the Commonwealth. French President Charles de Gaulle questioned British commitment to European ideas. They cited their attachment to the U.S. And actually vetoed their application in the 1960s once they had decided to join. After de Gaulle resigned, the path was cleared for the UK to enter, which ended up happening 15 years after the European Coal and Steel Community and then the European Economic Community were formed, with that decision at that time motivated primarily by the perceived benefits of free trade and also a bit of FOMO in the sense of fear of exclusion from what was happening. But the UK has always had a fairly uneasy relationship with the EU. Margaret Thatcher famously negotiated a budget rebate, and the UK subsequently negotiated various opt-outs, including to the Schengen free travel area and also to the single currency. The decision to hold the referendum has been described by a number of people as essentially psychodrama within the Conservative Party. So not only did you have this more general skepticism within the country about the relationship, but you had a lot of infighting within the Conservative Party with people having very different views about whether or not EU membership was a good thing. Back in May 2015, British voters elected a Conservative government, and then Prime Minister David Cameron confirmed in his victory speech speech that there would be an in-out referendum on Britain's EU membership. The Financial Times has done an interesting piece looking back at polling from that period, and it showed that Europe had not been a major issue for voters until politicians started to raise it. So when you look at what voters back then were interested in, it was much more your bread and butter issues of the health service, of education, and nobody, aside from some in the Conservative Party, were actually thinking that much about Europe. So in February 2016, David Cameron confirmed that he was going to campaign for Britain to remain and set the referendum date for June. The rest, as we know, is largely history. The referendum took place almost 3.5 years ago in June 2016, and British voters chose to leave the EU by a very narrow margin, 51.9% to 48.1%. People often ask, why did people end up voting the way that they did? In some ways, there's some similarities to some of the debates that we've seen in the U.S. in the 2016 election, also debates that we've seen elsewhere in Europe. The campaign certainly was motivated by a desire for economic sovereignty. The London government for decades had been bashing Brussels as imposing regulations like straight bananas, working hours, other things. And so when you constantly demonize Brussels, it makes it much harder to then persuade your population that actually what's happening in the EU is a good thing. Immigration debates played a similar role there that we've seen play out in other places, but it was not necessarily a fear of Syrian immigrants and others that we saw with the migration crisis in 2015. It was a fear of some of the member states, people coming from Central and Eastern Europe to live in the UK. There's always the proverbial reference to the Polish plumber who was coming in and working and in some cases being perceived as taking advantage of social benefits and other things in the UK. There certainly was a large number of mistruths that were put forward in the campaign, one of the most famous being the poster that was on the side of the double-decker buses in London suggesting that £350 million were going to be going from the EU back into the UK coffers. And people on the Leave campaign actually came out the day after the vote and acknowledged immediately that that was not actually an accurate pledge, but that really inspired a lot of people in that direction. There have been questions about Russian interference. Certainly there was an element of Russian money that was supporting the Leave campaign, Facebook ads, and other things. British officials tend not to put a large amount of emphasis on the extent to which the Russian money altered the outcome, arguing that there was a sufficient number of people with sufficient grievances or reasons to vote that they don't believe that it significantly altered the outcome. But there is a report that the British government has produced that Boris Johnson has decided to hold until after the election, which should provide some interesting information about what the government sees on that. There was also others that suggest that this was an English identity crisis. If you look at where people voted in Scotland, 63% of people voted to remain within the European Union, including majorities in all constituencies across Scotland. So Scotland has long had a much stronger affinity to the continent, even dating back to the old alliance with France in the 1700s. There was a narrow majority in Northern Ireland that voted to remain, and there was also a majority in London that voted to remain. So the bulk of the people wanting to leave were in England and in Wales, where it was always less comfortable to balance a sense of English identity, even with a British identity, not to mention a European identity on top of that. So then to look at the very protracted playing out of all of this over the last couple of years, and to do this in a very short way. David Cameron resigns as Prime Minister on June 24th, soon after having lost this Brexit referendum. We were talking earlier this morning that he does not seem to harbor great regrets about his decision to hold a referendum, which I guess enables him to sleep a little better at night these days, although he recently came out with his memoirs where he at least is somewhat apologetic for having created the situation that the country is in. And Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary, ultimately became Prime Minister. Somebody on Twitter described her attitude to the Brexit negotiations as the smart girl in class who's put in charge of the school project. And I really think this is an apt way of, all the women are smiling because they get this reference, that the way she handled this, I think, is really how she approached it. She herself had been supportive of remaining in the European Union, but by God, this is what the British people voted for, and we are going to get this assignment completed on time. And you, Boris Johnson, and all you other naughty boys that are not cooperating, my grade counts on this, and you better get in line and help get this done. In March of 2017, March 29th, May formally notified the EU of the UK's decision to leave. So this is when people talk about invoking Article 50. Article 50 is the clause in the EU treaties that sets out in very general terms how a country withdraws. There had been a little back and forth about whether or not Parliament was allowed to have a say on this, which they ultimately did. The problem was that she triggered this 2-year clock under increasing domestic pressure without actually having a clear plan of what they were wanting to negotiate and what their position was. So she started this 2-year clock without knowing what her end state was. She then made her life even more complicated by holding elections on June 8th. So the Conservative Party at that point had a governing majority within Parliament. She thought she would get a bigger majority that would strengthen her negotiating position with the EU, and was polling up 21 points in the poll before the election. She had a disastrous result, lost her majority, and in order to be able to govern, had to go into coalition with the Democratic Unionist Party, which is the hardline Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. So she was in an extremely weak position going in, and this helps explain why it was so hard for her to ultimately get her deal through Parliament. So soon after that, divorce talks began with the European Union. Another pivotal factor in all of this was that there had been a disagreement between the UK and the EU about how to sequence things. The UK from the beginning said, we want to talk about the divorce and the future relationship at the same time. The EU said, no, we're not going to do that. We need to complete the divorce first. You need to formally leave the European Union. And then once you're out, we can talk about what your future relationship is going to look like. So there's a certain logic to the EU's position in that you want to conclude the formalities of the divorce. You want to finalize that and then have a discussion. In practicality, and what we saw play out in the subsequent negotiations, a lot of these questions about how you structure things in the near term are affected by what the future relationship is going to look like, especially with this question of Northern Ireland. And so some would argue that decision, that insistence by the EU, has contributed to some of the complications about where we are now. Come back to the question of the backstop for Northern Ireland, which is one of the most complicated factors in all of this, and really is part of what made it so difficult to get things concluded. So in November of 2018, after 18 months of negotiations, the sides finally reached agreement on a Brexit deal. So when we talk about the Brexit deal, it's actually two separate documents. The first is the withdrawal agreement. That essentially sets out the framework of the divorce. And it includes a number of things. First, it covers all of the separation issues so that you can ensure a smooth winding down of all of the current arrangements, to ensure that goods that are currently in transit can get there, that police and judicial cooperation on things can get wrapped up. There's a financial settlement. The EU does its budget in 7-year tranches, and the UK had agreed to the budget running through the end of 2020. So just like if you and a roommate move out, you got to settle the electrical bills, and people had committed to certain budgetary things being done, and the EU, not surprisingly, wants the UK to pay up on what it had agreed to. There also need to be provisions to protect citizens' rights. There's over 3 million EU citizens living in the UK and over 1 million UK nationals living in EU countries. And so they want to ensure that people can still get their pensions, that people are going to be able to get access to health care. There were protocols that were done for Cyprus and Gibraltar, where the UK also continues to have bases and interests. The second part of the Brexit deal is much shorter. It's the political declaration, and that's only a couple pages long, and it sets out non-binding legal principles that will govern what the future relationship is going to look like. That's the part that has to be negotiated next. So the important thing to know on all of this is Brexit is going to be with us for many years. Even if we end up getting this wrapped up in the next couple of months, we really are only at the end of the beginning, because we then need to negotiate what the future relationship is going to look like. And if you think that divorce negotiations were complicated, discussions on this future relationship are going to be even worse. Now, the issue with Northern Ireland got extremely complicated. So in a nutshell, the situation there, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998, it was done within the context of the European Union. And so you had the UK and the Republic of Ireland that were both EU member states. You've got these northern counties on the island of Ireland comprising Northern Ireland that are part of the UK. So when the UK leaves the European Union, it'll leave its customs union and it will leave its single market. And so you will now have what has largely been a non-existent border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland will become the external customs border. So it will be the only land border that the UK is going to share with an EU member state. And because the UK is leaving these economic arrangements with the EU, there is a need to protect the goods that are crossing over that border. So the same way the US wants to check goods that are crossing from the US into Mexico, the U.S. into Canada, there need to be mechanisms to ensure that things that are crossing are both known and in compliance with the regulations of where they're going. The problem with this in Northern Ireland is that because of the history of the conflicts, it really raises existential questions to put any sort of physical infrastructure on the border. And so the question became, how do you protect the sanctity of the EU's economic market without imposing physical infrastructure that's going to create problems? There was lots of discussion about even having technical mechanisms or something there. But again, if you have a population that was traumatized by the divisions of the island, that as part of the Good Friday Agreement, you tore down these customs checkpoints, these border crossings, these police things. Having drones, for example, flying around is not going to give you much confidence that the state is not conducting surveillance on you in a politically oriented way that would be reminiscent of what happened in the past. So the initial arrangement that Theresa May came up with was going to keep Northern Ireland in a customs union with the European Union, and the rest of the UK would be outside of that. Now, because the DUP was propping up May's government, they refused to have Northern Ireland be treated separately from the rest of the UK. They saw this as paving the way to Northern Ireland eventually leaving Britain. And so they forced her to work with the European Union to change it to keep the entire UK in a customs union with the European Union. Now, for the hardline Brexiteers, this was extremely problematic because part of the benefit of Brexit was supposed to be that you had the ability to negotiate your own trading arrangements. And now you essentially had the worst of both worlds, where you were bound by the EU's economic rules, but you no longer had a seat at the table to implement any of those rules. So this was the deal that Theresa May was trying to sell in Parliament. And given the very fragile majority that she had in Parliament, it simply wasn't possible. So to run through a number of things that have happened over the last year, December 10, so almost exactly a year ago, Theresa May planned for the first time to bring her deal to Parliament for a vote. She ended up delaying it because she thought that it was going to face certain defeat. Her own Conservative Party then brought a vote of confidence in her leadership. She ended up winning this vote of no confidence, which should have secured her leadership for another year. On January 15th of this year, she finally brought the vote to Parliament, and it suffered the largest defeat for any government in the modern era, being voted down 432 to 202. The opposition then brought a vote of no confidence in May's government, which she survived because the DUP propped her up. So the DUP did not like her deal, but they did not want to see her brought down and have Jeremy Corbyn become prime minister. So on March 12th, she brought the deal back to Parliament. It got defeated a second time. And we were now very close to the original deadline for Brexit, which was March 29th of this year. So on the eve of the crash, the EU offered its first extension. By March 28th, Theresa May said, I will go as Prime Minister if you support my deal. She brought the deal back to Parliament 2 days later, and they defeated it a third time. So finally, on April 11th, the two sides agreed to extend the Brexit deadline to Halloween. And so that was where we were up until a couple of months ago. Then, May 23rd, the UK has to hold elections to the European Parliament because as one of the conditions of the extended deadline, the UK is still a member state. And there was concerns that you would have democratic illegitimacy within the EU if the UK did not have representatives in the European Parliament. So you then have a rather farcical situation where the UK is holding elections to an institution that it is trying to leave. And to make things even more crazy, the Brexit Party, whose sole purpose was to get the UK out of the EU, not only wins the elections in the UK, but forms the single largest party within the European Parliament. Not surprisingly, the next day, Theresa May finally throws in the towel, says she's had enough. She will step down as Conservative Party leader and will serve as a caretaker until her successor was chosen. So we then had a leadership contest, and on July 22nd, ended up with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. We then had very interesting and complicated parliamentary machinations this September after Boris Johnson came in, where he decided to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks. So there was lots of confusion initially about what prorogation meant. If you think about it in an American context, we have House elections every 2 years. And so every 2 years, Congress winds down. Bills that were introduced in that session do not get rolled over into the next one. The slate is wiped clean after those 2 years, and things have to be reintroduced. Because Britain has a parliamentary system, there is not an obvious mechanism to reset the clock to end legislative sessions. So prorogation is something that's actually quite normal, tends to happen once a year or so, where the legislative slate is wiped clean and new provisions are then introduced. It is very unusual to decide to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks and essentially say Parliament is not going to sit at all during that time period. But that is what Boris Johnson decided to do. His argument was that now that he was Prime Minister and not Theresa May, he needed to introduce his own legislative agenda that he would be addressing within this session. And the political parties all hold conferences once a year to discuss their own platforms. And so during that time, Parliament is recessed for a number of weeks. Not surprisingly, the opposition was very unhappy. They said that they were being silenced over this. They took the British government to court, and Boris Johnson actually lost. It was technically the Queen who suspended Parliament, but the Queen cannot be held at fault. And so what they decided was that the government misled the Queen in telling her to suspend Parliament, and so they ended up undoing the suspension. In some ways, all of this debate became moot because Parliament achieved, before it was suspended, what Boris had essentially been trying to prevent it from achieving, which was that they passed legislation known as the Benn Act, which blocked a no-deal Brexit. And so what the Benn Act said is if there is not a parliamentary-approved agreement on Brexit by October 19th, which was 2 weeks before the Halloween deadline and the day after the EU summit was happening on October 17th and 18th, then you need to request an extension. Boris fought against this, but ended up losing. Boris was so unhappy that a large number of Conservative MPs voted against the government to ensure this extension to prevent a no deal that he expelled from the Conservative Party everybody who had voted in favor of the Benn Act to prevent a no deal Brexit, expelling 21 members of the Conservative Party, including notably Winston Churchill's own grandson. So all of these MPs had the party whip stripped. They were no longer MPs, and Boris Johnson was then 45 seats short of a parliamentary majority. Now, in the midst of all of this, Boris Johnson actually succeeded at doing something Theresa May was not able to do, which is he renegotiated the Brexit deal. And in particular, he managed to renegotiate the unpopular backstop for Northern Ireland. So what he did, following a tete-a-tete with Leo Varadkar, the Irish leader, is removed the backstop from Northern Ireland completely and replaced it with a special protocol for Northern Ireland. And so what that says is that the UK as a whole is going to leave the customs union. That was one of the things that was a hard line for the Brexiteers. But then in a complicated situation, Northern Ireland is going to remain aligned with the EU customs union and also with VAT provisions. And there was a consent mechanism put in place for the Northern Ireland Assembly to have to ratify this decision 4 years after the end of the transition period, leaving aside the fact that the Northern Ireland Assembly has now been suspended and not met in over 3 years. But that was the arrangement that was put in place. So essentially, rather than checking goods going north-south on the land border in Ireland, it shifts the border to the Irish Sea, which is the east-west water in between the island of Ireland and the island of Britain. Not surprisingly, the DUP, again, very unhappy with this because they feel like they are being carved off. And the more that you have differentiation between the UK and the EU, the greater the differentiation is going to become between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. But Boris got his deal. He was going to go back to Parliament and ask Parliament to vote on this. He was cognizant of the fact that he was working on a timeline given the Benn Act, which said that by October 19th, you have to get this passed. Otherwise, you have to request an extension. So Boris, on October 19th, holds a special Saturday session of Parliament, comes back and says, look, I fixed it. I got rid of the backstop. You all need to vote on this. Now, the opposition said, we don't actually trust you because we think that we are going to give you this so-called meaningful vote approving Brexit, even though it won't be fully implemented. You might not ask for the extension, and then we might end up crashing out before Halloween anyway. And so the big fear among a lot of the opposition was that the UK would crash out with no arrangements in place. And then all of those things I described about citizens' rights, the transition period, the financial arrangement, none of that would happen, and the UK would start trading on WTO rules with the EU. You would have all sorts of chaos at land borders, people stockpiling food and medicine and all the rest of it. That was the big fear in Parliament. So an MP named Oliver Letwin introduced an amendment and said, we are going to withhold parliamentary support for the deal, not just until a meaningful vote is held on the deal, but until the domestic implementing legislation for the deal is put in place. And until that happens, you have to guarantee that there is an extension and that we are not going to crash out. So on this special Saturday of Parliament, they did not have a vote on Boris's deal. The Letwin Amendment ended up passing. And very shortly before midnight on October 19th, Boris, who had promised do or die, we are going to leave by Halloween, who said he would rather be dead in a ditch than ask for an extension, was forced to ask for an extension. And so what he did was took a photocopy of the Letwin Act with the instructions requesting the extension, wrote a cover letter essentially saying, I don't agree with this, but here you are, and had his perm rep in Brussels submit that to the European Union. Boris, at this point, decides that what he really needs to do is hold general elections because he's in a very complicated situation in Parliament. Now, it used to be that a prime minister could decide to hold snap elections and they would happen, but a number of years ago, Parliament had passed the Fixed-Term Parliament Act. That says 2/3 of Parliament needs to agree to dissolve Parliament to hold elections or you can't do it. Boris went 3 times to Parliament to ask for elections. So there was a rather bizarre moment when the impeachment hearings were starting in Washington, and you had Trump assailing Democrats for trying to oust him. And at the same time in London, you had Boris Johnson heckling the leader of the opposition for not supporting elections and bringing down his government so that people could go to the polls. What he did not expect was that Corbyn was going to resist this call to go to early elections, which is exactly what Corbyn did. Again, because people were concerned that this extension was not going to be granted, and they really wanted Boris to have to face the electorate not having delivered on Brexit. So on October 22nd, Boris Johnson decided to try again legislatively. He was not allowed to bring his deal back to Parliament for this meaningful vote because Speaker Bercow, as had happened with Theresa May, said you've already had Parliament vote on this legislation. You can't have Parliament vote repeatedly on the same issue. So what Boris did was he brought the domestic implementing legislation to Parliament for a deal. Now, you remember the Letwin Amendment said you need to pass the domestic implementing legislation. Once that is done, we know no deal is not going to happen, then we can move forward. So Boris Johnson thought if he could get the domestic implementing legislation passed quickly, then he could rescind this request for an extension and he could keep all of his promises by having delivered Brexit and not had to ask for an extension. So the vote ended up passing 329 to 299. So this was the first time that Parliament had agreed any sort of Brexit deal. The way the parliamentary system works is you have three readings. The first one is a formality. This was the second reading, which is essentially saying, okay, we're prepared to move forward with this legislation. You would then normally have committee hearings, oversight, looking at all the details before things go back for the third reading. So it's significant that Parliament voted in favor of the deal, but just because you vote for the legislation to proceed in the process does not necessarily mean you're going to support final ratification. Parliament was then asked to vote on a second thing, which was the program motion. It was the timetable setting out how you would consider this process. Boris wanted this legislation passed within 3 days, because if you do it within 3 days, then the European Parliament can ratify the Brexit deal and you can get out before Halloween. Parliament said, no way. It is a 115-page bill. We only saw it yesterday, and it has to do with these very consequential changes to our country, given that we're going to be leaving the European Union. Someone pointed out on Twitter that even the Wild Animals in Circuses Act got more legislative time than what Boris was proposing for the Brexit bill. So the timetable was opposed 322 to 208. So on October 28, 3 days before the deadline, Brussels, who had been watching all of this drama playing out in London over the last couple days, said, fine, we'll give you your extension. French President Emmanuel Macron, in particular, is very fed up with all of this. He had advocated a short extension in the spring. He was advocating a short extension again now. But they said, look, we're going to go on the little photocopied piece of paper that Boris Johnson sent us. The Letwin Amendment says it wants the extension until January 31. That's what we're going to give them, and that's what happened. Once that was done, Boris Johnson came back to Parliament with a one-line bill, which was a one-sentence amendment to the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, and said, we will hold elections on December 12th. Because that was a piece of legislation, it only required a simple majority vote. So you then had this crazy situation where the SNP and these other opposition parties essentially goaded the Labour Party into backing this, saying that the extension was now secure. And then they decided to abstain from the vote because they had wanted it to be earlier when more students were going to be home and thought that there was going to be less time for Boris Johnson to do any hijinks. But at the end of all of that, we ended up with elections on December 12th. So that leads us to where we are now, a week out for these elections. It is very unusual for the UK to have elections in December. This was the first time since the 1920s that this is happening. Members are quite grumpy about having to go out and campaign in the cold and the dark. And there's also concern about security threats. There's a number of stabbings. There's already an MP that was killed a couple of years ago in part of the fighting over Brexit. So a lot of people are quite amped up. So this raises questions about depressed turnout if the weather is bad. It's leading a number of people to cast postal ballots so that they don't have to go to the polls, which means they essentially have to be voting by today. So whatever happens over the next week in the campaigns won't be affecting their decisions. And you've got a country that's incredibly divided. The same way the United States is really divided in terms of for or against Trump, the UK is very divided in terms of leave or remain on Brexit. And that actually is the essential fault line that people are voting on right now. So rather than traditional left-right divisions, it is leave and remain divisions. And you also have an incredibly volatile electorate. One of the statistics that's most striking is that in the last 3 elections, 49% of voters have switched parties, which is making it extremely difficult to predict where this is going to go. And the polls are incredibly difficult. In 2015, it looked like the Tories weren't going to do that great, and they got a majority. In 2017, as I mentioned, they had them over 20 points up, and they ended up losing their majority. So it's a complicated choice for voters because it's getting at Brexit issues and it's also getting at economic issues. On Brexit issues, Boris Johnson is saying this is the chance to get Brexit done. Give me a sizable majority. I will bring the Brexit bill back before Christmas and we can be out by the end of January. At the same time, he is also trying to put forward a more favorable economic agenda. The Tories had long been supportive of austerity. They have backed off that, and they are actually promoting increased spending on bread and butter issues like the National Health Service, like policing, crime, and education. For those who are opposed to Brexit, you would think the obvious choice then is one of the opposition parties. So you have the Labour Party, the leading opposition, headed by Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn is a lifelong Eurosceptic. He is personally supportive of Brexit, and so has not been the most resounding voice in support of the benefits of the European Union. And given divisions within the party, they've come up with a slightly complicated situation where Jeremy Corbyn says, if we are elected, we will renegotiate the Brexit deal, and then we will bring it back to you in a referendum. And we will decide before the referendum whether we're going to support or oppose Brexit at that point. So voting for Labour does not necessarily give you a super clear perspective on Brexit, even though it is clear that you would ultimately have a second referendum. He is putting forward a very radical economic policy. He's a self-declared socialist, and his economic policy proposals certainly run along those lines. He's talked about abolishing private schools. He's talked about renationalizing industries. And so for a certain number of people, especially if you're mid, upper class, wealthy, Jeremy Corbyn's socialist policy proposals are likely to have a much bigger impact on your livelihood and way of life than Brexit necessarily would. So that makes that a very complicated choice. He's also very unpopular personally, and there's been a lot of complaints about how he's handled anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. So then you have the Liberal Democrats, who you think would be surging as the third party in all of this. They initially said, we're going to get a majority, and if we win, we're going to revoke Article 50. We're not even going to bother with a second referendum. We're just going to be done. Voters, even those who support staying in the EU, were like, I don't know if that's super democratic. We still want to have a second say in a referendum. So they have now pivoted to say, we know we're not going to win. We know you don't really like that idea, but vote for us so that Boris Johnson doesn't get a majority. And we will support the idea of a second referendum if Labour wins, but we really don't like Corbyn, and so we won't back him as prime minister. So also not a super clear position there either. You have the Scottish National Party doing very well in Scotland, of course, but that's a little bit of a problem because they still really want independence. So maybe you don't like Labour and the Conservatives. The SNP are voting to remain, but you're not sure if you want to have independence, and so that's a bit complicated. So really, it's going to be unclear going in. You're going to have a lot of tactical voting. People are going to have to game out who is going to best suit their interest in a particular constituency, and you really are going to have one of two outcomes. One is that Boris Johnson wins, and the bar for him to win is actually quite high because there are no opposition parties that will support him in coalition, as even the DUP, who had propped up May's government before, does not like his Brexit deal. So he needs to win a sizable enough majority that he does not need a coalition partner. If that happens, he will bring Brexit back, and Brexit will likely happen by January 31st. On the other side, Labour does not need to win as many seats. They could govern with a as a minority government if they needed to. And then they could get support from some of these other opposition parties on a case-by-case basis. If Labor wins, then you will almost certainly have a second referendum at some point in the new year. It will likely take about 6 months to pass the legislation, means test the question, campaign, and get us to the point where there is a second referendum. And it is unclear what the result of that would be. It looks likely that Remain would win, but probably only by a couple of percentage points. Again, I think it's easy for us often to look at this from the outside and say Brexit's crazy. Everybody now knows how complicated and bad it is. Obviously, Remain is going to win by a huge percentage. British people would say to the Americans, you guys now see how crazy Donald Trump is. Obviously, you are not going to reelect him in 2020. People who voted for him before are going to totally change their mind in the election. Well, you know that is not the way politics is playing out in the U.S., and that is not the way politics is playing out in the U.K. Opinion polls do not show a sizable swing in terms of people's attitudes toward Brexit. There certainly are a number of young people who have now come of age and would be likely to vote. But you also have people who are incredibly sick of politics, sick of voting, and really just want the whole thing to go away. So I have been talking for far too long, so let me stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions on any aspects of this that you may have.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.